What is up, guys? FrostyOsty0232 here today for another Frosty feature. It feels like all of a sudden we have a brand new team that we're going to start talking about and we're going to hop into. So here it is, the Out of Time team, our first character. One of the, I think the most anticipated character from Out of Time coming to Marvel Strike Force, Black Knight. Everyone, as of the recording date, thinks that he is going to flip the arena meta, and I believe he actually was just released for our whale friends just a couple of days ago. So today we're going to talk about him. For those of you who haven't been to a Frosty Features, what this is a comic book background on the tunes that you use in Marvel Strike Force, and I am the dude to help you out with that. So let's begin. According to Scopely, what this is I read the blog post description of who the character is, and then we rate it at the end of the feature. So what we've got here, Percival of Scandia was a member of the court of King Arthur in the 6th century who operated. Let's try that again. Percival of Scandia was a member of the court of King Arthur in the 6th century who operated in secret as the Black Knight. Along with being an elite athlete and fighter, the Black Knight wielded the ebony blade in battle, a sword forged by the sorcerer Merlin that could cut through any substance. But the ebony blade was cursed to slowly corrupt any user and cause a lust for violence, bloodshed, and death. Percival constantly struggled to fight the curse while fighting alongside the Avengers against the likes of Morgan Le Fay in his own and across time. Probably one of the worst ways I've ever read one of those, but there it is. All right, so that is Scopely's description of Percival of Scandia, the Black Knight. Let's see what Frosty has to say. Debatably, there's our man. There's a chance that could be Dane Whitman after Percy has possessed him. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But anyway, the gist of this is that's what the Black Knight often looks like. The hero ones. Name Sir Percy or Percival of Scandia, just like it says in the blog post. Sir meaning that he is knighted for Camelot. First appearance, Black Knight #1 in 1955. In comic book history, timeline, whatever, Percy was in fact the first Black Knight we've got, but Percy was only around for something like 5 to 10 issues. He was not around very long at all, and he disappears for almost a decade before he comes back. As a reminder, in the 1955s, for those of you who don't know comic history, superheroes were almost entirely taken out of mainstream media in the comics and things like that. So Black Knight did not survive. He did not survive that at first until we see another Black Knight come later, and then Percy gets sort of come back to around once we see Dane Whitman. Power/abilities, he has none. He's an advanced sword fighter. He can sword fight. He wields a blade. But the Black Knights, one of the coolest thing about the Black Knights is they are fairly powerful people, but they have no powers. There's nothing special about them besides the fact that they know how to fight. They are just people wielding a magical item. Aliases, pretty much none. Hand of Fate is one of them because of how much the Black Knight may turn the fight in a battle, and it is brought up. But for the most part, all of the Black Knights are called Black Knight, and we'll get into that bit a little bit here in a while. Affiliations: Knights of the Round Table, Percival of Scandia. Percy, he wasn't around much. He couldn't be a member of much, but he was a member of King Arthur's court. He was one of the knights that King Arthur fought alongside King Arthur, so his only affiliation really is Knights of the Round Table. You can make an argument for his spirit being affiliated with the Avengers, but that's a bit of a stretch because he's dead. But you know, what does dead mean in comics? So I only wrote down Knights of the Round Table. Background: the 500s, so the 6th century, which is the 500s, Camelot. He is the son of a knight, so he is the son of a knight of King Arthur, and then due to some prophecy and worry, his dad takes him to Scandia and raises him there, where then a baron of Emsauer destroys Scandia and kills Black Knight's parents. At this point, Merlin's like, okay, you can come back to us. So he summons Percy back to Camelot. So Percy is not from he's from Camelot, but he's not from Camelot. He was born in Camelot, raised in Scandia, come back to Camelot, right? By request of the Merlin. And on his arrival, Merlin's like, yo, dude, you need to, like, don't let everybody know that you're actually kind of a bad dude. Show up and be foppish. And foppish, for those of you back in the day, this is a high class, probably couldn't take a punch or they'll break. Very, very kind of weak presenting individual. And so what happens is, when there's a fight breaks out, Sir Percy essentially runs off into the bushes and comes back as the Black Knight, and then fights the Black Knight. So even to, like, King Arthur's court, he is operating in secret as the Black Knight, which, once again, this is extremely short-lived, so this isn't super built upon, other than he is secretly the Black Knight. It is what it is. Yeah. They don't really hit on that too much after he dies, and once again, he dies super fast. Who died? Can't be a superhero, supervillain without without somebody dying. And in the case of the Black Knight, as I previously said, his parents were killed by the Baron of Emsauer. So that's what it is. So, the ebony weapon. So let's talk about so as I said before, the Black Knight is nothing special except for his sword. So his sword is a very, very big deal. We actually got a peek at his sword in the god-awful Eternals movie in the MCU. It was an after-credit scene, and we get to see the ebony blade. This is the Dane Whitman version of the Black Knight. So what the ebony weapons are: a meteorite landed in Camelot, and Merlin took Percy, actually used Percy. So after having him come and he summoned him, he took Percy and he was like, I found this meteorite. You're going to forge these into these like a list of weapons. So Percy is tasked with making these weapons out of this meteorite called Starstone. So in the event that Marvel actually wanted to, or excuse me, Scopely actually wanted to do anything interesting in the game, this could be a new material that we have in the game. It's probably not going to be, but like a new type of gear could be Starstone. And because we have weapons, there are a few, and I'm about to list them, but there are a few ebony weapons. The ebony sword being the most prevalent overall. But essentially, it is a meteorite, Starstone, and he's like, you're going to make these weapons. And so he makes a chalice, a shield, a staff, and a sword. And then after making them, Merlin's like, now choose one. And Black Knight, or Percy at the time, being a sword fighter, decides to go with the ebony sword. At which point Merlin is like, okay, that is yours now. I'm going to enchant it. So we have the ebony blade. So the ebony blade is a really fascinating weapon. The Black Knight, in full disclosure, before getting this Frosty feature ready, I was only familiar with Nathan Garrett and Dane Whitman Black Knights. I was not familiar with Percy very much at all. I knew he existed, but that was essentially the extent of my knowledge. So this is all stuff that I went back and read, and he has such a small amount of comics he's present in. That's not very hard. So with this, the ebony blade, the way that this works, right? So Merlin enchants it. The way this enchantment works is that the wielder of the ebony blade is invulnerable to death. They can be injured, but they can't die unless they are killed by a weapon of the same metal. Right, and I listed off the things that are made of all of the metal that even today here. Oh my gosh, 70 years later, even today, this is all of the star stone that I'm aware of, are these ebony items, right? And to the point where one of them one of them was taken to the underworld and it was reforged into the ebony dagger. That was the ebony staff, so that doesn't even exist anymore, because after Percy chooses his, Merlin throws all of the other ebony weapons into I believe it's called the river Archeon, and he makes it disappear. And then later Mordred, which we'll talk about Mordred a little bit, but Mordred makes it reappear and he gets the other thing. So he gets the ebony shield, the staff, and he converts the staff into a dagger. I think you see where this is going. Anyway, he is invulnerable to death except for by that same sword. And also there's just various other magical properties. Depending on who wields the sword, it can make like energy blasts, and it can make people fly, and it's a whole thing. But ultimately, another enchantment on it is that the only person that can actually truly wield the blade is somebody who is a descendant of King Arthur. And we'll talk of that bloodline of King Arthur, and I'll talk about that in the relationship side. But yes, Percy is related to King Arthur. So that's a thing. And then we have the curse. So that's the thing that I find the most fascinating. This sword essentially is one of the most powerful weapons in Marvel. But the cool thing about it is that it has a drawback, which most weapons don't, right? So the drawback on this, for years and years, this has recently changed in the King of Black arc, which was because I'm behind on current comics, but King of Black was one of the last ones I read, actually going to the comic book store and grabbing things off the shelf. So up until King of Black, the way that this worked is Sir Percy really did not have the drawbacks. I'm going to throw this down right now. Back in the 50s, the drawbacks weren't there, right? But the way the curse worked, it was a blood curse that was spilled because Sir Percy killed so many people with the ebony blade that so much blood got on the blade that a blood curse was seeped into the blade. And the way this blood curse worked is the more blood, so whoever was wielding the sword, the more blood that got on the sword, it brought out the way it was, it essentially drove them mad and they became evil. So the more blood you spilled wielding the ebony blade, the more evil you became. As of the King of Black storyline, Null, which, yes, this blade has something to do with Null, which I haven't heard anybody talk about, but everybody keeps talking about Null coming to the game, blah, 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 blah. Null actually has a direct retcon to the ebony blade. With this, Null comes down and he's like, yeah, that's not how the curse works. Y'all are nuts. That blade is cursed in such a way that when you use it, it just brings out the evil inside you. And in fact, you can't even use that sword if you're not impure of heart, which makes Dane Whitman be like, oh my god, why did everybody lie to me? And blah, 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 blah. But it was a retcon, but it's kind of a neat retcon. Ultimately, yes, there's a... And it's not like a Thor wielding situation either, because you can pick up the ebony blade and try to use it, but there's a situation where I can't remember which character it was, but essentially somebody else had the sword and they swung it at him, and instead when they hit his arm just stopped the blade altogether. Which part of the enchantment of this blade, which is brought up in the According to Scopely, is that it can cut through almost anything. So the ebony blade can cut through anything except extremely tense metal. So it can cut through most metals, but in canon, when coming up against the likes of adamantium, it cannot go all the way through. So you can actually combat it with adamantium. But it's a cool other thing about the sword is that it can cut through anything. So it's quite a blade at the end of the day. But yeah, so it's extremely powerful, but it is to the determent of the mental wherewithal of its wielder, which I think is just such a cool thing. All right, moving on. A legacy hero / villain. So I've brought up in a couple times in Frosty Features, I've brought up legacy heroes. This is one of the OG legacy heroes. So a legacy hero is essentially a mantle that can be passed from one person to another. So I've already brought up that there's 3 Black Knights, and people have inherited the Ebony Blade more so than there are being Black Knights, I guess is a way to put it. And also, like, even in the King of Black storyline, we find out that Dane Whitman is, like, the 9th person to wield. We thought he was the 3rd, but he's the 9th person to wield the Ebony Blade, and it's a whole thing. But ultimately, Percy has other, like, when Percy dies, he leaves the Ebony Blade to somebody else, but they didn't take up the mantle of Black Knight. We don't see the mantle taken up of Black Knight until from 500 BC all the way until the 1960s, where we see Nathan Garrett take it up, and he takes it up as a villain. So that's the other thing is, obviously, if you're using the Ebony Blade, you can go mad. Therefore, it's pretty easy to be a villain. So over time, the different people that have donned the Black Knight guise, the Black Knight name, have also swapped back and forth between being a hero and a villain. Namely, they're heroes. Really, as far as I'm aware, Nathan Garrett's really the only, like, major villain that was Black Knight. And Nathan Garrett's still around, as Dane Whitman is a Black Knight, so that is somebody who pops up randomly. Think of him as like an Iron Man knight, and he also happened to have a magic sword. And then when he is more or less slain, he calls on his, like, nephew. I'm pretty sure that's how they're related, but his nephew, which is Dane Whitman, and Dane Whitman's like, I'm gonna be a good guy. And then the Avengers are like, oh, hey, you look like that bad guy we took out one time. But today we're talking about Percy. We're not talking about Dane and Nathan. Okay, so stop trying to get me to do it. Ultimately, Black Knight is a perfect example of what a legacy hero or villain is. Relationships. So the relationships are very important here. So Percy, for Nathan Garrett, for Dane Whitman, they are not direct descendants of him, right? So they are related to him, but they aren't. It's not like son. Nathan Garrett is not Dane Whitman's father, right? So with that, with the enchantment that was, you have to be of Arthur's bloodline to wield the blade. You see here, so Nathan Garrett descended, Dane Whitman descended. So those are 2 other Black Knights that are prevalent in Marvel Comics. Lady Rosamund, this is a character that Black Knight sees. He falls in love with her. She's not super with it, and then he ends up saving her, and they get married. Boom. And then Mordred, King Arthur, Morgan Le Fay. This is the big important part, right? They are all cousins of Percy. Percy is the cousin of those people, one way or the other. So they have a blood relation in some kind of way, which allows the descendants of Percy and other descendants of King Arthur to wield the Ebony Blade, right? I think by now that enchantment has been done away with, but I don't remember specifically. But at the end of the day, only certain people can make the Ebony Blade be effective, and I do think I still think that there is somewhere deep down in Marvel lore that it is still that connection to King Arthur. But anyway, so yes, Morgan Le Fay, Mordred in King Arthur. So Mordred being essentially an evil knight from the Camelot stories, is a cousin of is King Arthur, and then Morgan Le Fay in the stories, the actual Camelot stories. So all this translates to comics, and we see it all come around again. So there it is. Those aren't the only relationships. Since it's a legacy hero, you can find quite a tree connecting everybody one way or the other, but just be aware that I'm just kind of talking about the ones that kind of matter to what we're talking about today. Notable events. So Percy's death. As I said, he is not around very long, and this is a redrawing of his death. His death is sort of, we see it again. It's brought up when Nathan Garrett is Black Knight, and then in more modern comics, I believe this is actually from King of Black, where they talk back about Percy. I think it's around that time. But anyway, in a more modern, like, Dane is learning what happened. This is Percy's death. So he saves Lady Rosamund is kidnapped by Mordred. Mordred very often is the person, and Mordred and Morgan Le Fay kind of working together are the bad guy. And so he ends up saving her. They get married, and everything in the land of Camelot is super awesome and super cool, and things are nice, right? And then if anybody knows some of the Camelot stories and lore and rumors and whatever, you know how these things work, the myths of Camelot, there's a whole thing where Lancelot and Guinevere get together. So that's a thing in the Marvel lore. So everything is peaceful. Camelot's ruling, the world is great, And then all of a sudden, we find out that Lancelot has had relations with King Arthur's boo, Guinevere, and all of a sudden, there's civil war. So with this, Sir Percy has been living with Lady Rosamund and having a really good time, having kids, you know, just doing the life thing. And then he hears about the civil war breaking out, and he's like, I have to get to King Arthur. Oh my god, what are we gonna do? So then, he puts on his Black Knight garb, and he picks up his sword, and he's like, I'm gonna get there, and I'm gonna help the king. And he goes, and he's trying to, kind of just namely protect King Arthur. And he gets there, and King Arthur's dead, right? No bueno, not a good thing. And at the sight of the dead King Arthur, Percy loses his effing mind, right? Percy loses his stuff, and he automatically starts killing everybody in sight, and he kills a whole bunch of people, namely enemies, but he is bathing the blade in blood, right? Remember what I said? So he's bathing this blade in blood in the OG, so you can find a 1960s drawing of this where he's getting stabbed. In the OG one, he is setting the blood curse at that point. In the new one, it was already there, and he was going crazy here. But he's killing a lot of people, and then sneaking up behind him is Mordred. As I said, Mordred took the ebony staff, took it to the underworld, and reforged it into a dagger. Mordred sneaks up behind him and stabs him in the back with the ebony dagger, and as the enchantment says, Sir Percy can only be killed by a weapon made of the same stuff his sword is, and by golly, that ebony dagger's made out of starstone too, you big old loser. So, we find the death of Percy, leaving the ebony blade to his son, and it disappears for a very freaking long time, until the 1960s. By God, that's where we're at. So that was Percy's death. Percy's death, and the rest of this is pretty biased because it's the stuff I like. There are a couple stories of Percy like doing stuff in Camelot times and things like that, but they're very short, and it very much feels like a flavor of the week kind of thing. So in big Marvel lore, the more important thing about Percy is that he dies because his spirit does things that are much more influential than he did as a person. So the next thing we're going to talk about, I called the round of revives. So there is a situation in the round of revives that Dane Whitman, so we talk about Dane Whitman, that is the modern, in King of Black, he's the Black Knight. In modern comics in the MCU, this is our Black Knight, is Dane Whitman. He's super cool, Dr. Dane Whitman in the comics. A big thing about Dane Whitman is as he works with the sword, he fights back and forth about his mental acuity with the sword, right? He struggles a lot with his feelings and things like that as he has the sword, and eventually he becomes so corrupt that the corruption takes him over so fully, and he becomes literally a statue, right? Because comics. So, a aspiring magician, think Doctor Strange. We're talking Doctor Strange, Baron Mordo, side character, Victoria Bentley. So not super good at magic, but trying to figure it out. She tries to use a spell to make the and once again, you're fighting against, like, Morgan Le Fay and Merlin level magic, which is the highest level of magic there is. So if you think of how powerful Scarlet Witch is, Morgan Le Fay and Merlin are all up there, maybe even maybe with a slight edge on Scarlet Witch. Essentially this novice is like, I'm gonna break this spell, and he's gonna run around and be the Black Knight, and we're gonna be friends again. And so she casts a spell, and instead of that working, the spirit of Sir Percy possesses Dane's body, and so when and the way it kind of works is a little crazy, but essentially it's tied to his helmet. So if he has the helmet on, he is Sir Percy the Black Knight in Dane's body, but if he takes the helmet off, Dane gains control of the body again, which automatically makes him become stone, which is something they experiment with a little bit. Also, this is a fun time where they experiment with the ebony blade, where like Vision tries to see if he can phase through it, and he can't because of its mystical properties, which is super cool. But this is also when somebody else grabs the sword and hits somebody, and it's like, oh, that doesn't do anything. But so Sir Percy he comes back and he is the Black Knight, and we see in modern times Sir Percy operating as the Black Knight in Dane's body. So what in doing this also revives Mordred, who, once again, evil cousin of King Arthur, the one that killed Sir Percy originally in this picture we see here. And then we also see Morgan Le Fay come back, and Morgan Le Fay is nothing to play with, right? So in this situation, they are revived. Percy is operating as the Black Knight, and Morgan Le Fay and Mordred are able to capture all of the Avengers, and except for the Black Knight, and they essentially put him at the edge of a blade, and they look at Black Knight, and Morgan Le Fay's like, you swear fealty to me and become my Black Knight, or I'll kill all of the Avengers, right? And Percy's like, well, I'm in a tight spot, fellas. Come back next week. But also, it's comics, so that wasn't a thing. So he was like, I'm in a tight spot. I'm going to have to do this. So he gets on one knee and he swears fealty to Morgan Le Fay, agreeing to be her knight. And then, as he, so he's being their knight, the Avengers are let go and they get away. And then as, the fight is ensuing, instead of fighting his friends, he gets up on his steed and he's like, I'm not going to do this. We'll make this work a different way, and flying through the air. So some of the Black Knights, Percy actually doesn't, but Nathan Garrett and Dane Whitman have horses with wings, Pegasus types, and they're flying on these horses with wings. So in this situation, he's flying on Dane's horse, and he's like, I have pledged my fealty, my undying loyalty to Morgan Le Fay, but Dane Whitman has it. And he grabs his helmet and he rips his helmet off, and he effectively destroys the helmet, releasing his spirit, and he uses his own spirit, his spirit magic energy, to grab Dane Whitman by his stupid head and scream in his face. None of this happened. He threw the helmet, his spirit came out, and he uses his spirit to cleanse Dane Whitman. So Dane gets control of his body. He takes on the role of the Black Knight again. He wields the ebony blade, and he takes out and fights Morgan Le Fay and Mordred, with the Avengers, and all is well. And then he goes on to lead the Avengers and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, that's that. There's a few things where Dane runs into the spirit of Percy, and he sort of acts as like this mentor thing, because the predecessor to Dane, Nathan Garrett, essentially Percy's ashamed of him, so he never helped him do anything. And then when Dane got the sword, Dane's like, oh, here's a family member I can be proud of. You're the Black Knight. You're gonna do things. So essentially, in a moment of intense whatever, or what have you, Percy may appear to Dane Whitman and help him out, right? So those are two cool notable events for Percy. There's not a whole bunch of them. I didn't go over all of them like I do some of the characters, but because when he does have an event, it's kind of interesting and intricate. But it doesn't take that long to read all the stuff with Percy in it, so I highly recommend checking it out, namely because I also highly recommend reading into some of Dane Whitman's storylines. He's got a lot more to him, even Nathan Garrett. The whole story is pretty cool, especially here 70 years after it started, and there was gaps where he wasn't there. Very interesting character, lot to bite into. Power level. Marvel Strikes Force does not care about power levels, but here in Frosty Features we do. Now the way that this works, if you are a multiversal threat, that means you are a threat to all of reality, not just your reality. No. You can topple the multiverse at a whim. If you are a universal threat, though, you can topple your reality, perhaps hop over into another one and take them out one by one, or something like that. Cosmic threat means you are a threat on a planetary scale. On the small end, and with enough time and effort, you could take out something like a solar system or a small galaxy. Nuclear means you have power equal to that of a nuclear bomb, leveling things like small cities up to a planetary body, once again with enough time and effort. Super Soldier is beyond all human capability to a point, right? So the whole thing about Captain America being at the absolute peak of human ability, I disagree. He is beyond. He's lifting tens of thousands of pounds on occasion. So Super Soldier are people that can level things on the small end, like punching through a brick wall, and on the high end, leveling a city block. City level means you are a human, but you are trained to the absolute and utter peak level of human ability that there is in Marvel and Marvel Strike Force, where we see a lot of these characters are our street level fighters, our secret agents, our mercenaries, etc. And then there's Greg. Greg is the undead Asgardian that is spawned by Hela in Marvel Strike Force, and by himself, Greg's not really worth that much, and due to Asgardian physiology and other things, I posit that I, the regular guy walking down the street with my pet Pomeranian, could theoretically use my pet Pomeranian as a flail, right? And theoretically, if Greg attacked me, I, as the regular person with my Pomeranian flail, could theoretically kill Greg. My Pomeranian probably wouldn't make it due to the nature in which I'm using it as a weapon, but there we are. I theoretically could beat Greg. Greg, I equate to a regular human being, and in the case of Black Knight, Percy of Scandia, what we are looking at, once again, this is a character, Percy, Nathan Garrett, and Dane Whitman. None of them have powers, right? But we see this power of the Ebony Blade. The Ebony Blade, its powers seem to change depending on who's using it, and I've talked about Null a couple of times in this feature. According to Null, humans can't even access the full extent of the power of the Ebony Blade, and due to the fact that King of Black is relatively recent, I'm assuming that eventually we're going to see somebody of a higher caliber than human pick up the Ebony Blade and use it in such a way, maybe even Null. But humans can't access its full ability, but different humans, especially if you look at different universes, Black Knights in different universes, they do different things with the Ebony Blade. The Ebony Blade has a lot of power. So, with this, you have to kind of equate it to who's wielding it. So with this, my argument for Percy is that he is at a nuclear level. We don't really see him use it, but he teaches Dane how to use it at such a level. Therefore, he has an idea of how to bring out its powers, but for the most part, we just see him using a really awesome sword, and that's a thing. So he very much is on the lower end of nuclear scale. As I said earlier in the feature as well, it can shoot things like energy blast, things like that. So, we are saying the Black Knight, even though it's a regular person, they are using a strong freaking weapon, and nuclear it is. So, according to Scopely, this is close, but far enough away that it's just kind of wrong. He was operating in secret as the Black Knight. He was athletic and a fighter, but he actually didn't have the Ebony Blade starting out. He had to forge it. He forged it. Merlin enchanted it. It said it's forged by Merlin. The Ebony Blade, it says in here the Ebony Blade was cursed, and that it brings out that lust of violence stuff. That's been retconned in the comics and is no longer true according to Null, and it just happens to brings out their it doesn't cause them to have a lust for violence. It brings out their inherent lust, and you have to be impure to have it, because that is outdated in the comics, and Black Knight for us as of this recording date is a new character, and ultimately they had total access to know that that's no longer the situation for the Ebony Blade. So saying it's a little off, and yes, that's it. So with that, as far as according to Scopely goes, they didn't even try. It takes a very short Google to find that Null has rewritten the story of the Ebony Blade. It is brand new. There's no reason not to see it. That storyline finished before they started developing Black Knight, because that was a few years. That was like in 2020. So it was a few years ago now. So at the end of the day, they didn't even try. They could have done a quick Google to alleviate this pain. And that is Frosty Features Black Knight. I hope that you all had a good time. Please let me know your favorite Black Knight moments in the comments, or if I got something wrong. Once again, we're focusing today mainly on Percy, even though I talked about Dan an awful lot. It's really hard not to. He's awesome. I stream, as a reminder, every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Central Standard Time at the link above, where we do Frosty Features live. Also, please like, share, and subscribe this YouTube video. It helps out the channel so much, and it doesn't cost you anything but a couple of clicks. And I hope that you all have a fantastic, fantastic weekend. Most importantly, stay cool.